On the afternoon of October 16, 1991, a crispness hung in the mountain air of northeastern Spain. Enrique Martinez, a man of 36 years with a neatly trimmed mustache and a weariness etched around his eyes from long nights behind a bar, was out mushroom hunting. He was joined by his wife Ana, a vibrant woman who always sought adventure, and their friends, the younger couple Jorge and Sofia. Jorge, the self-proclaimed expert on local legends, had practically dragged them all to this remote region, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling mix of excitement and anticipation. He'd heard whispers, dark stories about an abandoned town called Lusara, and was determined to experience it firsthand. Enrique, however, couldn't have cared less about haunted tales. He craved the peace of nature, the quiet rustle of leaves, and, of course, the thrill of finding prize-winning mushrooms, a welcome escape from the boisterous chaos of his bartending gig in the busy port city of Tarragona. He was particularly hoping to find revelans, or bloody milk-cap mushrooms, planning a celebratory feast for his friends and wife back home. Remember to like and subscribe for more spooky tales. Adding to the already oppressive atmosphere, a thick mist was beginning to roll in, swirling around the ruins like a shroud. It was barely afternoon, yet the fog, which Jorge had claimed was a trademark of Lusara, was already descending, swallowing the town in an eerie, spectral embrace. Jorge broke the silence, a gleam in his eye. "All right, folks, I want to show you something truly special," he announced, grabbing Sofia's hand and practically dragging her down the main road towards the church. Enrique and Ana exchanged a knowing glance, then followed, their pace a little slower, a little more cautious. After only a few steps, Enrique glanced back at their starting point. The crumbling structure was already completely obscured by the swirling fog, as if it had never existed. A shiver ran down his spine. He knew this was supposed to happen only at night, not in the middle of the day. Shaking off the feeling, he hurried to catch up with Jorge and Sofia, who were now standing before a strange, rectangular rock jutting from the ground, its surface worn smooth by centuries of exposure. Jorge placed his hand dramatically on the rock, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This, my friends, is the Cyst stone," he declared. "Legend says it contains dark powers, magical energies of immense potency." He then launched into a detailed account of the stone's history, explaining that Muslim armies, who had once marched through this region, would stop at the Cyst stone, believing it imbued them with the strength to conquer their enemies. Touching the stone, Jorge claimed, was incredibly risky, potentially leading to being sucked into a parallel world teeming with demonic entities. Then, without removing his hand, he challenged, "Come on, who's brave enough? Who else wants to touch it?" Sofia, predictably, recoiled in horror. "Absolutely not. I am not tempting evil spirits," she declared, shaking her head vehemently. Ana, however, ever the adventurer, stepped forward with a mischievous grin. "You know what? I'll touch it," she said, taking a deep breath and placing her hand on the stone. The group held their breath, anticipating something. But nothing happened. A minute passed, and Ana removed her hand, laughing nervously. "Well, that was anticlimactic," she said. But just a couple of seconds later, Enrique noticed something very strange. The frogs in the pond near the church, previously a background murmur, had suddenly become deafening, their croaking a cacophony that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Enrique turned his gaze towards the pond, trying to make out its shape through the swirling mist. The sound was almost painful, like the volume had been cranked up to an unbearable level. He could vaguely discern the outline of the church behind it, but the fog obscured much of the detail. Then, for a fleeting moment, the mist parted, revealing a window of the church. And in that window, he saw it. A dark figure, motionless, standing and staring directly at him. The vision vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the fog once more. Before Enrique could even attempt to process what he'd seen, Ana's voice broke through his shock. "Come on. Enrique, your turn," she called, still laughing and unaware of what he had just witnessed. Scanning his friends' faces, he saw nothing but amusement. No one else had seen the figure. Convinced he was imagining things, Enrique decided to play along. He plastered on a forced smile. "All right, fine," he mumbled, walking up to the stone and placing his hand on its surface. Immediately, everything changed. The air grew noticeably colder, a chilling contrast to the strange warmth emanating from the stone itself. A tingling sensation spread through his hand, followed by a powerful, almost irresistible pull. A voice, not his own, seemed to whisper in his mind, urging him to stay, to remain connected to the stone forever. Wow, I could do this for hours, he thought, feeling an unnatural sense of peace and contentment. I could just stay here and leave my hand on the stone. This is amazing. Amazing. But somewhere, deep within his consciousness, a primal instinct screamed at him to stop. Get away, it warned. Take your hand away, get away right now. With a jolt of effort, Enrique yanked his hand from the stone. The sensations vanished as abruptly as they had appeared. The air returned to normal, the urge to touch the stone disappeared, leaving him disoriented and unnerved. Ana and Jorge, grinning expectantly, waited for him to describe his experience, but Sophia, clearly agitated, cut them off. Guys, let's get away from this cyst stone. I don't want to continue to tempt evil spirits, okay? Let's just go, she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Jorge, rolling his eyes, put his arm around her reassuringly. Lighten up, Sophia. It's just a bit of fun. Come on, let's do some more exploring, he said, taking her hand and leading her further down the road towards the church. Ana, always eager for adventure, skipped after them like an excited child. Enrique, however, hesitated. Even though he had convinced himself that the figure in the window was a figment of his imagination, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. This whole village, enveloped in the eerie fog, felt off. He wanted to leave, to put as much distance as possible between himself and Lusara, but he didn't want to be a party pooper. Reluctantly, he turned and followed his friends, his unease growing with every step. After walking a short distance, the fog briefly parted, revealing the pond, teeming with its impossibly loud frogs, and the church with its empty, silent window. The window was dark, empty. No signs of any figures in sight. Was he really just seeing things? He could see his friends were nowhere near the church, they'd passed it and seemed to be walking around in the cemetery. The sensible thing would be to just keep going, just ignore whatever he thought he saw at the window of the church. As Enrique walked past the pond and started cutting along the side of the church to get to the graveyard, he just stopped. He had to. It was as if something was compelling him to look at the window again. Enrique didn't know why, but he found his legs carrying him to the window of the church. At the window he was standing with his eyes glued to looking at the church. There was nothing inside, but he was staring and staring for what felt like an eternity, as if some unknown force was compelling him to look into the church window. After a few minutes doing that, Enrique leant closer to the church. The urge to stop wasn't working, his body was just taking him there. As he leant closer to the church, he could hear the frogs. The frogs were loud as heck and filled his head. He could think of nothing except frogs. They were so loud. They filled his brain, and it was almost like they were compelling him to step inside. Around the corner of the church in the cemetery, Ana, Jorge, and Sophia were laughing and messing around in the graveyard. Looking up and taking stock of where everyone was, Ana noticed that Enrique wasn't in the graveyard with them. Ana wandered to the entrance of the graveyard and noticed her husband stood and looked at the church. "Hey, what you doing? Get in here," shouted Ana as she desperately tried to get Enrique's attention. Enrique did not move. Was he really going to look into the church again? Ana wandered up the side of the church and grabbed him and told him to snap out of it. She said he had the strangest look on his face when he stared into the church. She was worried. Dragging him into the graveyard, she didn't think of it again. She started skipping happily back to the graveyard and started looking at the tombstones. It was a pretty spooky and run-down graveyard. Lots of the writing was faded so that it was hard to read. Some of the tombstones were covered in moss, which was a bit grim. Taking a few steps backwards so that she could see what was on a particularly interesting headstone, she stumbled. As she fell, she leant back on one of the headstones, which then fell backwards and cracked. "Oops," she shouted. Jorge and Sophia went over to her and started laughing. "Oh no. You've disturbed the witch's resting place," said Jorge with a hearty laugh. As Ana started putting the tombstone back up, she had a grim thought. "Is it true that this place is cursed?" asked Sophia tentatively. I'm getting the creeps a bit." And then Jorge told them a story that had been passed around about this place for years. It was something truly chilling that had been passed down, and it was all about how the curse came to be. They started to get more and more creeped out by that. Anna looked around as she had a horrible thought. "Where's Enrique?" shouted Anna. Back in October of 1873, during the Carlist Wars, Jorge began, his voice dropping to a dramatic tone. This area was a battleground. One of the rival armies, the Carlists, were using the caves in the mountains near Lusara as makeshift hospitals for their wounded. One night, a very famous Carlist general named Cyst was badly wounded in battle. He was brought to one of these caves, and that's where he died. Now, Cyst was a beloved leader, a real hero, and so the soldiers inside the cave desperately wanted to give him a proper burial. But they also knew they had to keep his death a secret. If word got out that their leader was dead, it would crush morale, demoralize the men, and practically hand the victory to their enemies. So, 6 of the soldiers inside the cave built a makeshift coffin. They placed Cyst inside, and early the next morning, under the cover of darkness, the 6 of them carried the coffin up into Lusara. They secretly buried him in the cemetery behind the church. Weeks later, 5 enemy soldiers, those fighting against the Carlists, climbed up the mountain into Lusara to look for General Cyst. They didn't know he had died in that battle. Nobody outside of those 6 soldiers knew he was dead. They believed Cyst was hiding out in Lusara, recovering from his wounds. Jorge paused for effect, his eyes gleaming in the fading light. So, these soldiers started barging into the homes of all the civilians. Ripping their houses apart, looking for the general, he continued, his voice rising with intensity. They dragged the people out into the streets, threatening to kill them unless they gave up information about Cyrus's location. Finally, after hours of this, an elderly man, who had simply had enough, stepped forward. He told the enemy soldiers that General Cyrus was dead and buried in the cemetery behind the church. The soldiers didn't believe him, of course. They demanded proof. The elderly man admitted that he didn't know exactly where in the cemetery Cyrus was buried, only that he had heard that was where he was. Enraged, the soldiers ordered all the townspeople to gather in the cemetery and to start digging. They demanded they dig up every single grave until they found Cyrus. As Jorge spoke, he gestured dramatically, his voice echoing among the crumbling tombstones. So, the townspeople, terrified for their lives, began digging. They began to dig at the graves looking for this general that was buried in their graveyard. Now, as the townspeople were digging, something very strange happened. The sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder, growing into a deafening cacophony. It was a chorus that filled the graveyard, becoming almost unbearable. The leader of the enemy soldiers, growing increasingly frustrated, actually stepped away from the chaos in the cemetery and walked over to the pond. He started firing his gun into the water, trying to get the frogs to shut up, but it was no use. They only got louder, their croaking intensifying with each gunshot. Finally, defeated, the leader gave up on the frogs and turned back to the cemetery. And that's when he saw it. All the townspeople had stopped digging. Exhausted, distraught, and having unearthed every grave in the cemetery without finding Cyrus, they were waiting, terrified, to see what the soldiers would do next. But the leader of the soldiers, as he scanned the graveyard, noticed something peculiar. There was one grave, very conspicuously, that hadn't been touched. Every other grave around it had been disturbed, the earth overturned, but this one remained undisturbed. So the leader walked over to the group and started pointing and shouting. He had identified the grave. Why wasn't it dug up already? "Dig that one up," the leader shouted. The townspeople hesitated. They didn't want to get near it. One of them stepped forward, trembling, and told the leader that it was the grave of an old woman who had recently died. She was old, and that's about all they knew about her. Her husband had died years ago and she mostly kept to herself. A lot of people thought she was a witch, and that it would be dangerous to disturb her resting place. The soldiers scoffed at this explanation. Witches, they laughed at. They started pointing guns at the locals' faces, demanding the grave be opened. Scared, the locals did as they were told. They unearthed the coffin and were about to open it. As they prized the lid of the coffin open, the locals all gasped. The corpse looked like she had just been buried the day before. She was lying on her back and her skin was very pale. Her cheeks were even flushed with color like she was still alive. All in all, an unholy sight, but there was something that horrified the locals and even silenced the soldiers. The woman's eyes were open, and as the light hit them, the whole crowd thought she was staring straight at them with burning rage. For what felt like an eternity, everyone stood in stunned silence. Then the locals just broke. They started screaming and ran back from the grave. The soldiers were shaken. The image of the witch would haunt them all forever, but they still had a job to do, so they shouted and cursed at the locals, demanding they come back. Fueled by rage, the soldiers grabbed the witch and dragged the body out of the grave. They then hung her from a tree in the graveyard and used her as target practice, firing repeatedly at her body. It was a vile act, but the soldiers were beside themselves with rage and needed to take it out on something. As they fired the last shot, the gunfire stopped. It went silent. There was no wind, no frogs, no sounds, nothing. This terrified the soldiers so much they didn't say a word to each other, they just ran for it. Abandoning their mission to arrest or kill General Ceros, they all just ran screaming and shouting, leaving the poor locals to deal with the fallout. As the soldiers left, the locals all ran back to the graveyard to start tidying up. As they went about their business, one of them jumped into the grave that the witch was in. When they landed on the bottom, their leg went through the dirt and they were standing on something else. Thinking they may be standing on a tunnel, they started pulling back the dirt, and after a short while they saw what they were standing on. There was another coffin underneath. This secret coffin belonged to General Ceros. So that makes sense. Why hadn't they seen that? As it turned out, the soldiers had been secretly burying this and had decided to bury the general on top of an already planned grave. The witch and the general both died in a time where these people were already burying them and had merely been chucked in on top of a planned burial. However, the secret coffin was covered and the witch buried on top. But because they thought she was a witch and generally evil and horrible, they decided not to write her name on the headstone. Instead, they just etched a horizontal line across her headstone. So no one would know who she was and they could forget about her. How messed up is that? So after this incident happened, Lusara has never been the same. It turned into a ghost town after word of the bodies were desecrated spread. Bad luck has spread throughout the entire village. With that story being over, Anna was terrified to understand what was going on. That's the headstone I broke, Anna stammered, staring at the ground. The one with the line. It was the witch's grave. A wave of fear washed over her, the light-heartedness of the afternoon completely extinguished. She was about to grab Jorge and Sofia and tell them they needed to leave now, when she glanced over at the base of one of the cemetery walls. And there it was, the perfect, crimson-capped bloody milk-cap mushroom. The exact type she knew Enrique had been searching for all afternoon. A flicker of hope sparked within her. Perhaps this wasn't so bad after all. Perhaps finding this mushroom would be a good omen, a sign that things would be all right. She picked the mushroom, holding it up to the light, admiring its vibrant color. Eager to show her husband, she turned around. But Enrique wasn't in the cemetery. Her heart skipped a beat. Had he followed her back down into the cemetery after she saw him by the church? She couldn't remember. She thought he had, but she wasn't sure. Enrique, she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Enrique, where are you? Only silence answered her. Panic began to set in. She turned to Sofia and Jorge, who were barely visible through the swirling fog. Have you seen Enrique? Is he in here? Did you see where he went? They both shook their heads, their faces etched with concern. No, we haven't seen him. We have no idea where he went, Sofia replied, her voice barely audible above the rising wind. Anna dropped the mushroom as though it had burned her hand. He's gone, she cried, fear seizing her. Without another word, she turned and ran, sprinting out of the cemetery, her heart pounding in her chest, desperate to find her missing husband. Sofia and Jorge, not fully grasping the urgency of the situation, exchanged a worried glance. They didn't understand the primal fear that had gripped Anna, the chilling premonition that something terrible had happened. They followed her out of the cemetery, but more casually, their pace far slower. Turning the corner, they exited the cemetery and began walking alongside the church, the fog swirling around them, thick as pea soup. They couldn't see Anna, but they could hear her voice, calling out Enrique's name over and over again, each shout laced with rising hysteria. As they moved along, shadows danced in the fog, playing tricks on their eyes. They would see a fleeting glimpse of a figure in the distance, thinking it was Enrique or Anna, but as they approached, the shadows would vanish, dissolving into the mist, leaving them with an unsettling sense of emptiness. Sophia gripped Jorge's arm tighter, her earlier amusement replaced with genuine fear. Even Jorge, who had been joking about the haunting and the evil spirits, was now starting to feel a prickle of unease. They quickened their pace, trying to reach Anna, to offer comfort and reassurance. And as they got closer to Anna, the sound of the frogs in that pond grew louder and louder, until it was almost deafening. Their croaking filled the air, overwhelming everything else, drowning out even Anna's frantic cries. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the croaking stopped. The abrupt silence was even more unnerving than the noise, a vacuum of sound that sent a chill down their spines. All they could hear now was Anna's sobbing, a broken, desperate sound that cut through the silence like a knife. They couldn't see her, the fog was too thick, but they followed the sound of her sobs until they found her huddled on the ground, her back to them, right in the spot where Enrique had been standing, staring at that accursed church window. Sophia and Jorge reached down, placing their hands on her shoulders. She turned around, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with terror. Clutched tightly in her hands was Enrique's wicker basket, the one he had used to collect his precious mushrooms. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her words filled with utter despair. Enrique's gone. Anna, Jorge, and Sophia would spend the next hour searching in vain for Enrique in Lusara. The fog was getting thicker, the darkness was rapidly closing in, and the sounds of the forest, previously comforting, were now filled with a sinister undertone. They shouted his name until their voices were hoarse, stumbling through the ruins, desperate for any sign of him, any clue as to what had happened. But there was nothing. Only the fog, the darkness, and the growing sense of dread. Eventually, with the last vestiges of daylight fading and the air growing increasingly cold, they had to make a choice. They had no idea where Enrique was, or what had happened to him, but they all felt, deep down, that staying in Lusara any longer would be suicidal. With heavy hearts, they made the agonizing decision to leave, promising themselves they would return with help. The authorities launched a massive search of Lusara. The three friends told the authorities all that had happened. With no signs of anything, the investigation was getting difficult and the search was called off. In January of 1992, Anna, Sophia, and Jorge returned to Lusara, driven by a desperate hope that they might find some clue, some trace of Enrique that the authorities had missed. The snow on the mountain was thick and the atmosphere was deathly. They walked in relative silence. It was at that point that they happened to pass a certain window in the church. As they approached, it was as if all time and space stood still. The friends knew that something bad was about to happen. Then, they saw them. Through the church window, standing on the main floor, were 6 dark figures wearing robes. They were just standing, not appearing to be doing anything, just silently standing there. It was at this point that Anna got angry. It was one thing for her to be looking for her husband, but it was an affront to the worst kind of people to come here as some kind of thrill-seeking adrenaline junkie. The robed figure had no face, it was merely a dark hole. Although there was not a face, Anna could tell that they were looking right at her with intensity and malice. Then she took 2 steps back. From behind the group, an intense galloping was now approaching them at high speed. The whole group span round and could see nothing apart from fog. Remember to like and subscribe. Turning back to look in the church, the figures had all disappeared and the fog was the only thing that was there. After that, all the group had was terror to follow. Enrique had not returned and the story has since become a fable.